Hello, this is a video about what morality is. It's also about what morality is not and about political polarization. I'm presenting it as a response to a video, The Psychology of Polarization, Conservative versus Liberal, put out by Stand Together. In that video, Dr. Kurt Gray argued that morality is an evolved disposition to judge harming others as wrong. Furthermore, that morality is a cause of political polarization. I don't think that Gray gives the correct account of what morality is, and consequently that we can come up with a better understanding of political polarization. Let me start by going over Gray's argument. He begins by noting that we are animals. Okay, that's true. More important for Gray's thesis is that our biological ancestors were prey animals, the victims of predators. This means that they evolved to be watchful of threats, and they evolved defenses against those threats. I'm not going to dispute any of these claims either. Next, Gray argues that one of our evolved defenses against threats is to form groups, tribes, and colonies. 20 individuals can do more to protect themselves from a pack of wolves than a lone individual. I'll not dispute this. In fact, wolves also experience the benefits of forming groups. It's not just a human thing. Next, Gray notes that there's a problem with forming groups. Other members of the groups can be a threat. I think we have enough evidence of victimization of one member of a community by another to grant this as well. Then, according to Gray, to solve this evolutionary problem and to allow humans to live together without harming each other, morality evolved. For Gray, what is morality? This is the view that I'm going to reject. According to Gray, morality is an inner evolved sense that harming each other is wrong. And this felt wrongness is what inhibits us from causing harm to each other, allowing us to live together in peace. This inner sense also causes us to respond to harmful behavior with outrage and a compulsion to punish. Both liberals and conservatives have this same evolved morality, this threat response system. That's to say that both have this system that gives them an inner sense that harming others is wrong and a disposition to respond to threats with outrage and a compulsion to punish. The problem is that these threat response systems in liberals and conservatives are triggered by different things. For example, according to Gray, liberals see undocumented immigrants as being threatened by those who would abuse and exploit them, and they respond with outrage and an urge to punish those who would threaten undocumented immigrants, including conservatives. Conservatives, on the other hand, view undocumented immigrants as the threat. They take our jobs, and they are potential perpetrators, rapists, terrorists. Conservatives then respond with outrage and a compulsion to punish undocumented immigrants and those who would protect them, liberals. This then produces strong political polarization on the subject of undocumented immigrants. The solution, according to Gray, is to recognize that neither liberals nor conservatives are predators. They're not threats. They're just people trying to protect what's important to them. Both are doing what their evolved morality urges them to do, which is to respond to what they see as a threat with outrage and an urge to punish. My criticism will start with what Gray calls morality. As I said at the start, this is largely an essay about what morality is and what morality is not. What Gray calls morality isn't morality. In order to solve the problem of living in groups without harming each other, Gray says the following, quote, and so we needed a psychological trick, an internal sense to make sure that other people don't harm us. We needed morality, end quote. And this is false. To show that it's false, to justify my claim that it's false, I ask you to consider the following evidence. First, we have lots of examples of organisms that don't harm each other, and they don't have morality. Therefore, morality isn't needed to make sure that organisms do not harm each other. For example, there are colonial insects such as ants and bees. They don't harm each other, except in special circumstances, such as making sure there's only one queen. Yet, it's highly doubtful that they have a system of morality, a system of rights, duties, responsibilities, obligations, prohibitions, and that they draw distinctions between just and unjust punishment. Members of a hive may even sacrifice their lives for the good of the hive. But not because they see it as a duty or a moral obligation. They just do it. Here's another example: parental care for the young. It's quite unlikely that morality is required to bring it about that a bird builds a nest, cares for the eggs, and feeds the chicks that result. It certainly isn't required to make sure that the parent or other members of the flock, when flocks of birds nest together, do no harm to each other or to each other's offspring. On this matter, consider human care for their offspring. I have a feeling that you can convince a parent that morality is an illusion, that no act is right or wrong, and they will still protect and care for their children. Not because they judge it to be obligatory. They simply want the health and safety of their offspring, the way they might want a sandwich. So clearly, nature has tools other than morality for regulating the behavior of animals. We don't usually eat because we feel an obligation to eat or have an inner sense that it would be immoral not to eat. We don't usually have sex because we feel an obligation to have sex or an inner sense that it would be immoral not to have sex. We don't watch our favorite television shows because we feel an obligation to do so. We don't put on a coat when we go outside on a cold day because we sense that morality commands it. In short, Gray's thesis that nature needed to evolve morality to prevent us from harming each other is false. It could have easily given us an aversion to doing harm and a desire to help. No more related to morality than our aversion to extreme cold or our desire to eat. In fact, I would argue this is what we have, to some extent. This, then, is my first objection to Gray's thesis about what morality is. Dr. Gray says that morality is needed to prevent us from harming each other. There are many examples in nature of creatures prevented from harming each other without morality. Therefore, the claim that morality is needed is simply false. Now, somebody wanting to defend Gray can say the following: look, you're being unfair. Maybe morality isn't strictly needed to make sure that people don't harm each other, but it sure helps. And perhaps that's all he needs to say. That defense isn't going to work. Before I give my next objection, I want to give an idea of how the argument flows. So let's assume that somebody tells you some horses have 8 legs. When you ask them to back up that claim, they point to a small creature in the corner of the window sitting in a web and says, see, 8 legs. Of course, the proper objection to that argument is to point out that what the person is pointing to isn't a horse. It's a spider. Dr. Gray says that morality is responsible for political polarization. When asked what morality is, he points to an alleged evolved internal sense that some actions that harm others are wrong. My response is that what he is pointing to isn't morality. What he's pointing to is tribalism, and tribalism isn't morality. Dr. Gray is saying that morality is something that explains political polarization. However, morality is not concerned with what explains behavior, it's concerned with what justifies behavior. And what Dr. Gray is pointing to doesn't justify political polarization. Therefore, it's not morality. What do I mean when I say that morality is concerned with what justifies behavior? I mean this: morality, whatever it is that which allows us to tell the difference between right and wrong actions. Morality allows us to tell the difference between what is obligatory and what's prohibited, and what is neither. It marks the dividing line between just and unjust laws, just and unjust punishments. Morality is concerned with what ought to be the case. Okay, to understand this difference between explanation and justification, perhaps it'll help to look at the difference between explaining and justifying a belief. Somebody might believe, for example, that the earth is flat, or that vaccines cause autism, or that greenhouse gas emissions are unrelated to climate change. Regardless of what any person believes, there's an explanation for how that person acquired that belief. It may be hard to discover, but it's there. But even though every belief can be explained, it's not the case that every belief can be justified. A belief is justified when it's properly grounded on the available evidence in accordance with reason, roughly. When we explain why somebody has a belief, we may well discover that it's not properly grounded on the available evidence in accordance with reason. In other words, we discover that the belief can be explained, but it lacks justification. We can say the same thing about actions. We can, at least theoretically, explain why somebody abuses a child or a spouse, or commits a rape, or steals something, or murders somebody. Every act can be explained, but it's not the case that every act can be justified. For an act to be justified, it has to be properly grounded on good reasons, just as a justified belief needs to be grounded on good evidence. An inner sense that something is wrong doesn't count as a good reason, as I will argue later. But this is enough for my second objection. If what Dr. Gray is pointing to as the cause of political polarization was actually morality, then it wouldn't only explain political polarization, it would justify political polarization. However, much of political polarization cannot be justified. If it could be justified, then it would not be a problem in need of a solution. Therefore, what Dr. Gray is pointing to and calling morality isn't really morality. Now, against what I've said so far, one might argue that there's nothing that justifies an action. Morality, at least the way I describe it, simply doesn't exist. All that exists are these attitudes that some things feel right and others feel wrong. To answer this objection, I'm going to have to give an account of morality. And I promise I'll do that before the end. I want to quickly review the two objections that I've given so far. Then I have a couple other criticisms of Dr. Gray's views. My first objection was that Dr. Gray said that morality is needed to keep us from harming each other, and I provided evidence from ants and bees and birds and the parental care of our own young that show that this is not the case. Second, Dr. Gray said that morality explains political polarization, and I countered that if he is actually pointing to morality, then it would not only explain political polarization, it would justify it. And many aspects of polarization cannot be justified. So I have a third objection. Dr. Gray says, and I quote, morality is a way that we feel internally that we shouldn't want to harm others, unquote. What does this phrase, shouldn't want to harm others, mean in this context? We have a feeling. Where do we get the conclusion that this is a feeling that an action is wrong? Here's the problem. If I say that something makes an object appear round, I need to know what it means for an object to be round. And if I say that something makes an object appear red or appear larger than it really is, I need to know what this means. But what does it mean to say that something, an inner feeling, makes something appear wrong? Here's another way of stating the problem. When something appears wrong to us, how do we determine whether this is genuine wrongness or merely an illusion of wrongness? We recognize that looking at a white object under a red light can make the object appear red, even though it's white. It's white in virtue of the fact that it appears white under normal lighting conditions. We know something can make an object appear round when it's not actually round, such as an artist's drawing. And obviously, we recognize a difference between how big an object appears and how big an object actually is. Otherwise, we couldn't even conceive of something appearing larger than it actually is. So what's required for something to actually be wrong? How are we to tell when an appearance of wrongness is seeing genuine wrongness and when it's an illusion? When Dr. Gray answers the question of what morality is, he tells us of an inner feeling that makes something appear wrong. But he doesn't tell us what it takes for something to actually be wrong. So, in summary, here's my third objection. Referencing something that makes an object appear a certain way, wrong, for example, requires a prior understanding of what it takes to be that way. Dr. Gray provides us an account of what it takes for something to appear wrong, but he doesn't provide us an account of what it takes for something to be wrong. Here, too, one can object to what I say by saying that there's no such thing as actually being wrong, that all we have are appearances. But if there are only appearances, this seems to say that we should abandon all of morality entirely. Morality is just an illusion. There's another option that I hinted at above. One can say that something is wrong if it appears wrong under normal circumstances. But what are these normal circumstances? Remember, those circumstances must tell us what justifies certain actions. My fourth objection concerns punishment. The question of the distinction between just and unjust punishment is an important part of morality. To say that an act is wrong is to say, or at least often imply, that punishing that person is justified. To say that an act is obligatory is to say that a failure to perform that act may be punished. Dr. Gray also says of this inner sense that, quote, it's also a way that if somebody does harm us, we feel outraged and compelled so that we can punish them, end quote. So now my question is, when is punishment just and when is punishment unjust? Are we to say that punishment is justified when the punisher feels an inner sense of outrage and an urge to punish? This would suggest that it is impossible for it to be the case that a person feels outrage and an urge to punish, and yet the punishment is unjustified or unjust. This seems absurd on its face. The fact that we appeal to something other than the punisher's sentiment to justify punishment suggests that morality is not to be found in that sentiment. It's in whatever it is that allows us to distinguish just from unjust punishment. The sentiment is not morality. In fact, this way of thinking gets morality backwards. In reality, we ask if the sentiment is justified by asking whether the person actually deserves punishment. We do not ask if the punishment is justified by asking whether the punisher actually feels the sentiment. Furthermore, if the inner sense justifies the punishment, then whatever triggers the sentiment deserves punishment. If homosexual acts trigger an urge to punish, then homosexuals deserve to be punished. If being proved wrong triggers this urge to punish, then the act of proving somebody wrong deserves to be punished. Here, somebody wanting to defend Dr. Gray might say that I'm misrepresenting his thesis. Dr. Gray explicitly said that morality involves an urge to punish those who do harm. Homosexual acts and proving somebody wrong do not do harm. My question to this response is, why? Why is an urge to punish those who do harm morality, and these other urges, where they exist, not morality? What justifies this distinction? My second response is to point out that it's simply not true that we feel justified in punishing all and only those actions that cause harm. If one owns a business, then that person is harmed by somebody else opening up a competing business down the street. But this is not a harm that warrants punishment. There is the special case of punishment itself. Punishment is harmful, but it's not a harm that justifies punishment. A feeling of outrage and compulsion to harm cannot be the whole story behind justified versus unjustified or moral versus immoral punishment. On the other side of the coin, we sometimes justify the punishment of those who do no harm. If it were true that actual harm is needed to justify a felt urge to punish, then it would always be a legitimate defense against punishment to say, I didn't hurt anyone. The drunk driver who makes it home safely doesn't harm anyone. The person who refuses to pay their fair share of taxes doesn't harm anyone. The person who could have pulled a drowning toddler out of a shallow pond but did not also did not harm anyone. There are, in short, all sorts of problems with trying to limit morality to simply felt outrage at harmful actions. In summary, my fourth objection to Dr. Gray's thesis goes as follows. Gray's thesis cannot provide us with an account of the distinction between just and unjust punishment. We don't respond to all harmful actions with a feeling of outrage and a felt compulsion to punish. And we sometimes respond to actions that do no harm with a sentiment of outrage and a felt compulsion to punish. Besides, punishment simply is not justified on the grounds that somebody feels outrage and wants to do harm to another person. In practice, we justify the outrage by saying that the punishment is deserved, not the other way around. I have one last objection to Dr. Gray's thesis that morality is an inner sense that it's wrong to harm others combined with an urge to punish those who do harm. I ask, where has this moral sentiment been during much of human history? Where was it during the Holocaust, when individuals were loaded onto railroad cars where they could be processed through murder factories with assembly line speed and efficiency? Where was it during the 30 Years' War, when armed bands roamed the area we now know as Germany, raping, stealing, killing, burning, virtually at will? Where was this inner sense during Stalin's purges, in which 6 to 9 million Russians died? And where was this felt urge among populations that held others as slaves? I can keep going. The siege of Jerusalem, the Crusades against the Cathars, Genghis Khan, the Armenian Justified, the rape of Nanking, Japan's Unit 731. Look that last one up if you have a strong stomach. Now, I'm not saying that every act of doing harm disproves Dr. Gray's thesis. Not all hearts or kidneys function as they should, and there may be some defective individuals with respect to an internal sense that it's wrong to harm others. However, the examples I provided are not those of a few individual exceptions in a larger moral population. I'm talking about cases where whole groups of people caused harm, and where the individual protesting the harm was the rare exception. So my fifth argument says, just look at history. You'll find little evidence of an internal sense that harming others is wrong. Some populations have a sentiment that it's wrong to harm some others, and some populations do not. And the speed at which populations change from one to the other suggests that this is a trait that's not a product of evolution, it's taught. So Dr. Gray's thesis that morality is an inner sense that it's wrong to harm others and an urge to punish those who do harm is false. First, nature did not need to evolve morality to make it the case that people did not harm others. Second, morality, whatever it is, justifies behavior, whereas such an internal sense can only explain behavior. Third, the claim that we have an evolved sense that certain things are wrong requires that we have an understanding of what it means for something to actually be wrong. Fourth, we can't use an evolved sense on the part of the punisher to distinguish between just and unjust punishment. And fifth, the widespread popularity of harming others and rapid changes in societies suggest that morality is not innate, that it's learned. Okay, enough criticism. Let me try to do something constructive. I've said that what Dr. Gray is pointing to is not morality, it's something else. What would that be? He's pointing to something that some researchers call tribalism. Tribalism refers to a psychological disposition to divide the world into us and them. We tend to see us, the tribe we belong to, as the paradigm of wisdom and virtue. We're the good guys. Now, this is obviously an exaggeration, but it illustrates the relevant point, and it's often not much of an exaggeration. In contrast, them, the other tribe, they're the barbarians at the gate. They are the malevolent horde that's out to destroy us. We must conquer and destroy them first. Since both sides see each other as the malevolent horde that must be destroyed, there's some truth to the belief that each tribe is a threat to the other. Now, this is close to Dr. Gray's thesis that we have evolved dispositions to view harming others as wrong. In fact, we've evolved aversions to harming members of our own tribe, just as we have aversions to harming members of our families. An aversion is not a disposition to see something as wrong. My aversion to eating beans is not a disposition to view eating beans as wrong. Dr. Gray also said that we've evolved dispositions to react with outrage and a compulsion to punish those who threaten us. In fact, our aversion to harming others extends only to members of our own tribe. Members of those other tribes, we have little aversion to harming them. In fact, we're often tempted to conquer and destroy them, and to take what is theirs as ours. Accounts for political polarization easily enough. Political tribes view their political tribe as the paradigm of wisdom and virtue, and the other political tribe as the barbarians of the gate that must be conquered or destroyed for the sake of civilization. Similarly, tribalism shows up over and over again in human history. People dividing themselves into different tribes, the wise and the virtuous us versus the barbaric them. Athens versus Sparta, Christians versus Muslims during the Crusades, Protestants versus Catholics during the 30 Years' War. It's this tribal brain that makes fascism so seductive. Everything is made subservient to the tribe, though in practice everybody is made subservient to the leader. Nationalism is a form of tribalism. And if you think that your tribe doesn't have a problem with tribalism, that only those other morally inferior tribes have a problem, then you have a problem with tribalism. Tribalism is a human problem. It's written into our genes. Now, if Dr. Gray's thesis is true, then these conflicts, and countless conflicts not mentioned, are all caused by morality. If Dr. Gray's thesis is true, then morality is the cause of a substantial portion of human death and suffering. And if Dr. Gray's thesis is true, then morality itself is immoral. Now, that's an implication that I have trouble wrapping my head around. Tribalism does have the power to influence moral beliefs, but tribalism is not morality. Tribalism can explain why people sometimes have the moral beliefs that they do, but tribalism does not justify those beliefs, nor the actions that result from those beliefs. So then, what is morality? I've said a lot about what morality is not. Can I say anything positive? Offer an account of my own that others can criticize? I proceed along a road that's very similar to Dr. Gray's. You see, long ago in our evolutionary past, some creatures acquired desires. A desire is a brain state that brings it about that the creature will count it in favor of one action plan over another, that the action plan will satisfy the desire. For example, I have an aversion to pain. My aversion to pain causes me to count it in favor of an action plan that it will not result in my being in pain. Now, as I said above, a desire or an aversion is not a sense that something is obligatory or wrong, respectively. It's a like or dislike, but it still has the power to influence behavior. And a desire still has the power to keep us from harming each other. Now, this counting in favor is not absolute. A desire has a force, a type of weight, and can be outweighed. It counts against an action plan, then it will cause me to be in pain. But it might count in favor of that same action plan, that I rescue a child or that I obtain something to eat. Some desires are malleable. They can be modified by experience. Food aversions provide an excellent example. Eat something and get violently sick within a couple of hours, and you may come to hate the smell, sight, taste, or texture of that food, even if it was not what caused you to get sick. Now, it's not the case that you avoid the food because you want to avoid future nausea. You might not even remember the earlier experience, and it takes a lot of brain power to remember the past experience and relate it to future actions. Instead, you have come to dislike the smell, sight, taste, or texture of the food itself. Next, as soon as nature created creatures whose desires were modified by experience, it began working on evolving organisms to create experiences that produced useful desires. The mushrooms mentioned above provide an example of this. They evolved to produce a toxin that causes nausea, and this nausea in turn prevents those creatures from eating things that look like or smell like the mushroom. What some plants do with chemicals, some animals do with behavior. A snarl, a snap, a swipe. These behaviors create in others dispositions to avoid repeating the types of behavior that triggered the response. A caress, a cuddle, the sharing of food or of sex, grooming. These behaviors create in others dispositions to repeat the types of behavior that triggered the response. The more intelligent an animal is, the better its ability to understand more complex relationships between behavior, responses, and their effects on dispositions. Individuals have reasons to create those experiences that will cause others to tend to perform more actions of a type that benefit others and fewer actions of a type harmful to others. For example, we may discover that there are certain desires, such as a desire to keep one's promises, or an aversion to taking something from another person without their consent, that nearly everybody has reasons to nurture in a community. Some of these will be rather obvious. Others will be rather obscure. Now, among humans, one way to nurture these desires and aversions is through the use of praise and condemnation. And we can sometimes reinforce the effects of these techniques by wrapping praise in a reward or wrapping condemnation in a punishment. Either way, there are certain things that people generally have reasons to praise to nurture in a community a desire to repeat acts of that type, and reasons to condemn, perhaps to punish, in order to nurture aversions to performing acts of that type. This means that there are types of acts where it is reasonable for people generally to say it would be a good idea to praise acts of that type, because doing so will nurture dispositions to repeat acts of that type, and a good idea to condemn acts of another type, because doing so will nurture within the community aversions to performing acts of that type. So what is morality? Morality consists in those desires and aversions that people generally have reasons to nurture within a community using praise and condemnation. People have reasons to praise keeping promises, helping others in need, to nurture dispositions to repeat acts of that type, and to condemn lying and deceptive manipulation, taking things without consent, breaking promises, and the like, to nurture aversions to performing acts of those types. In presenting his thesis, Dr. Gray also presents a set of rules that he says we should all follow in political discussion. Doing so would significantly reduce political polarization. He suggests that we simply recognize that others do not want to do harm, they only want to protect something that's of value to them. By acknowledging their interest in protecting what they value, our conversation should become more civil. Insofar as he's presenting a set of practices that everybody, liberals and conservatives alike, not only have reason to follow, but reasons to encourage others to follow, Dr. Gray is offering a way of distinguishing between the right and wrong ways of political discourse. All that's needed to make these moral principles is the assertion that people should praise those who follow these guidelines and condemn those who do not. Ultimately, I reject his suggestion. He seems to be saying that the slave and the abolitionist must respect the fact that the plantation owner is just trying to protect their plantation, that the white supremacist is just trying to protect the purity of the white race from the contamination of inferior races, that the Nazi is just trying to protect the Aryan race from the Jew. We should respect the despot trying to protect his autocratic power, or the mob boss trying to protect the profitability of his territory. But the thing to note here is that my disagreement with Dr. Gray over whether or to what extent people ought or ought not to follow these principles, it's a moral disagreement. It's a disagreement over what practices everybody should adopt. On this account, tribalism, a cause of political polarization, is not morality. In fact, tribalism is immoral. History shows us that tribalism has been the source of so much human suffering and death that people have no reason to use praise to nurture tribalism within a community. In fact, they have reasons to nurture aversions that would hopefully come to counter, to outweigh the behaviors that tribalism moves us to embrace. With this analysis in mind, I want to offer something that might help to reduce the harmful consequences of our tribal brain. It's something that each person can do, and the more people who adopt this policy, the better off we all will be. But nobody needs to wait for others to adopt it. Stop waving tribal flags. Stop flagging ideas as liberal or conservative, as the property of this tribe or that tribe. Simply ask whether the proposition is true or false. In my own writings, I simply don't make claims like conservatives believe this or liberals believe that, or here's proof of the virtue of this tribe or the viciousness of that other tribe. I simply ask whether the proposition is true or false, whether the available evidence supports that claim or does not. In doing this, it's easy to see that every tribe, like every individual, has some true beliefs and some false beliefs. Every tribe on some issue is likely to be the model of wisdom and virtue, and on some other issue, they're the barbarians at the gate who must be stopped for the benefit of civilization. Ask yourself, which of my tribe's beliefs makes us the enemy at the gate? Makes it important to stop us before we can do great harm? Because every tribe has at least one, at least every tribe made up of humans. So, on the issue of undocumented immigrants, which of the following propositions is true? 1. Undocumented immigrants are often the victims of abuse and exploitation. 2. Undocumented immigrants take jobs. 3. Undocumented immigrants are perpetrators, or sufficiently likely to be perpetrators to justify the harms done to them. And here's another question relevant to the issue of undocumented immigrants. Is one's attitude towards undocumented immigrants the product of a tribal brain that tends to seduce people into seeing others or them as morally inferior barbarians at the gate? So here's where I add the stuff about liking and subscribing, but only if you think this is worthwhile. If you think somebody can benefit from what I write, point them this way. And if you think I can benefit from what somebody else has said, point me that way. All in all, I hope that something that I said here may contribute to making your life and the lives of those you encounter better than it would have otherwise been. Good day.